So Michael has had a very wild, I'd say, history, especially early on in his career. You're sort of exposed to staggering levels of corruption straight out of college. First in Washington, D.C., here domestically, when you're working on K Street. And then in the UN, more on a global scale, when you were working on one of the largest humanitarian operations in UN history. And then you decided to become a whistleblower based on some of the stuff that you were exposed to. I mean, it's a pretty crazy story.
It's not a normal career track. No, yeah.
And then you decided to write a book about it. The book's called Backstabbing for Beginners, you know, an appropriate title. And then it was picked up and turned into a movie, which was recently released by A24, starring Ben Kingsley as your boss, Theo James as yourself, and then Jacqueline Bisset as well, right? So yeah, I'm very happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about some very light subjects. I'm just joking. We'll talk about a couple different topics, you know, on global corruption, what that means on a global scale, how it's related to us here at home, and a number of other things. So the Oil for Food program, right? This was happening before and after the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
It dealt with Saddam Hussein. After you released some information through, I believe it was an op-ed with the Wall Street Journal, it sort of exposed, you know, corruption on a global scale involving over 2,500 companies around the globe in over 66 countries as well. And there's definitely some very sketchy, powerful political figures that were involved on both sides of the scandal.
Very well-known one, yes, yeah, absolutely.
So I guess my first question to you is, like, how similar is the film to reality?
Well, it's more similar than I'd like it to be. The most similar thing, of course, is that I was exactly as cute as Theo James is. No, seriously, there were far more explosions. There were far more people that disappeared or found themselves investigated. You know, the judge investigating the corruption that had gone on in Iraq for years was blown up in a car after the war. The CIA, the KGB, everybody knew about it, was involved to some extent in abetting it, and it was one big open secret. Just to take you back a little bit, when I was 17, I came to my dad and had written a script. And my dad was a writer in France, and he said, no, you should not be a writer. That's too risky. You should be a lawyer. You should be an international lawyer. So I go to Brown, and we had a fantastic president, Vartan Gregorian, who then encourages us to go out there and make a difference in the world. So I'm thinking, okay, let's find ourselves a good law firm and get some practice and go to law school. And so I land on K Street at a law firm that belonged to the father of Bill Gates. So I thought, cool, I'm safe. This is probably going to be straight shooting law practice. The head of our client group was called Jack Abramoff. 9 years later, Casino Jack, as he came to be known, ended up on the cover of Time magazine as the man who bought Washington. So when I went to the UN, I was really trying to flee this aspect of politics. And I was ecstatic because I had landed a job in what would be the largest humanitarian program in the UN's history. And then things started to become a little clearer to me. Why was it the largest humanitarian program in UN history? Because we had destroyed the entire infrastructure of a warm, hot, in some areas, country that relied entirely on oil. But we came up with a solution. The solution was not to lift the sanctions because we didn't trust Saddam to not rebuild an arsenal. The solution was to let them sell oil, to take the money into a UN bank account, and from there to oversee all of the, the purchase and import of all of the products that the population needed. So when I was sitting with a spreadsheet, that's the fate of an entire country there. You're 24 years old, and if you make a mistake, that's people not eating for a month in some of the 18 governorates that were Iraq. We quickly noticed that there was one party that didn't have a seat at the table in the Security Council or anywhere, and that was the Iraqi people. And that made it possible for 2,300 international companies, including big companies, Siemens, Volvo, Mercedes, Texaco, the people who yielded as part of the Bush administration team. Every party in the Russian Duma got funding from Vladimir Putin through this program in the form of kickbacks in the sale of underpriced oil. So what we saw essentially was that we were able to get some food and some medicine to the population, but the cost of it was that they were getting the worst type of expired medicine, food fit for dogs, and that's a quote from an Iraqi person at the time, because we were observing them. We had UN observers drive around Iraq and ask people, did you receive your food basket this month? And a food basket, it wasn't a basket from chitarelas. It was really a ration in an old oil tank. And we treated basically an entire population as animals in a farm.
Was this only Iraq, or was it
surrounding
countries as well?
No, this was Iraq. Iraq was under the most stringent sanctions ever imposed on a country that had just been bombed back to the pre-industrial age. And our job was to get the civilian population back on track. So we were lobbying the Security Council to loosen the restrictions and allow more goods in. There was enough money. There was more money than the UN had ever seen. Our quarterly budget was bigger than the UN's entire budget. Oil money led to those sums. It was also very slippery money. So on this sale of oil and on the import of humanitarian goods in Iraq, profits were made illicitly through corruption and kickbacks, and funneled back into people like the ambassador of France to the UN. People we knew, people we saw every day. People that are, the heads of large companies. In Denmark, Novo is a big pharmaceutical company. They were also involved in it. So in these 2,500 companies, this is my world. This is the corporate world as I know it, as it existed at the time. So of course, it wasn't the most comfortable thing to be in a position to know that this was going on, and to know that the whole council knew about it, too. But Saddam was a very wily character. He liked to keep lists of who he was corrupting. And after the war, that list was passed on to me and to others, and found its way to a free Iraqi newspaper that had just emerged. They published it. And then phones started ringing in all the intelligence headquarters of every country that had overseen this. And there was general global panic, the likes of which I've never seen. The big question was the list real? And on that list was a name that sounded a bit too familiar. It wasn't spelt exactly like it should be spelt, but it was spelt the way Iraqis would pronounce our big boss's name. He was the boss of my boss. He had taken me under his wing. I liked him. And his name was on the list. He had also received kickbacks. So the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, the man associated with the man in charge of the whole program, had apparently taken kickbacks. I couldn't believe it, and I wanted an investigation because I thought it would clear him. It turned out that Kofi Annan's son Kojo was also involved in a company that had gotten some favorable deals, and so Kofi Annan had no choice. Once I came up with an op-ed, being the first member of the UN to actually say, the cat's out of the bag, we need to have a completely independent investigation of this. Then he took up that cause, and Paul Volcker, who's the former head of the Federal Reserve, who is, by the way, 7 feet tall and super intimidating, walked into the Security Council and asked him, are you sure you want me to investigate this stuff? And they didn't have instructions from their headquarters, and they passed a resolution saying yes, and suddenly we had 60 Scotland Yard, FBI, forensics investigators taking all of our computers, all of our files, and looking through everything, front companies from all over the world, and they uncovered everything. So this was the first time such an investigation on corruption had been done on a global scale. And I think one of the reasons we're here today is to try to draw some lessons and understand why it matters. Because
can you actually talk a little bit about the op-ed that you wrote, where it was released, and how you sort of went about that? Because it sounds like that was the moment in time when the whistle was sort of blown, right?
You could say that. There were some investigative journalists, there were some investigation in Congress, but nobody at the UN had opened their mouth and said, this is true. And we knew about it. And they knew that I was not an enemy of the UN or wanted harm to the organization, so it had a certain amount of credibility. And the cat's out of the bag is also language that people with a decent amount of intel training recognize as the code word for the secret's out. So I think it had an impact.
Mm-hmm.
It's a request I had made internally. I had called him up. I wasn't working there anymore. I had quit. And I told them, guys, you need to investigate this. And they're like, it'll blow over.
Well, there was this pin drive involved in the film, right? That it seemed like you were sort of kind of running around with from country to country, and you were able to get back to the States with this list on this pin drive.
So that's the film.
Yeah.
In reality, there was a Kurdish spy, as there is in the film, and that person didn't nearly get blown up in a car bomb attack. There were other players. I mean, this was a spy's nest.
Mm-hmm.
There was so much money to be had. We were, getting lunch all over town just to give information about how do you work through this program, because it was lucrative. Now, the point was, of course, to be humanitarian. And that's where you have the great imbalance that reminds us of periods in our history, like colonization, where the white man's burden was to go around and help these poor people while we were stealing their mineral resources. The same logic applies to all sorts of corruption, and we're going to get to some of them later, that affect us today in ways that we do not understand the importance of. We should be a lot more frightened than we are. But let me just give one example. After we invaded Iraq, liberated Iraq, and it was in the beginning seen as a liberation by a lot of Iraqis. But these same Iraqis had grown up for 13 years between two wars, looking at what was going on around them, looking at where their natural resources were going, and looking what they were getting. And they saw the West being in cahoots with their own dictator at their own expense. So how hard was it for ISIS and Al-Qaeda to recruit these young guys and make a complete mess out of the country for 10 years? It was very easy, because the entire ideology of ISIS and of Al-Qaeda, first of all, very similar ideologies. They're just competing groups, but their ideology is based on the notion of Western corruption. Boko Haram means, which is the African part of the terrorist networks now growing at a very rapid pace in sub-Saharan Africa, means rejection of all things Westerns. Literally, the words mean that. They feel that the West has corrupted their righteous place in the world, that there was a golden age of their culture, and that we have, in cahoots with dictators that, we imagined were loved by their people because the people didn't have a choice but to clap every time Saddam was at his balcony shooting his gun. What do you do? They were very dangerous. I saw the Mukhabarat at work. They were extremely dangerous people, and fear prevailed in those countries like nothing I've ever seen. Suddenly, you open that up, and the reactions are very interesting. People become tribal. People then. But the same thing happened, in Russia, and the same thing is happening in a lot of places in transition. When I graduated from college, was a very interesting time in the world. Walls were going down. Democracy was progressing across the board, across the world. Tiananmen Square, the Berlin Wall, it just looked like there would be no end to things. People talked of the end of history. People thought, okay, this is it. Capitalism and democracy are going to prevail, and we don't have to lift a finger. The problem is that corruption can very, very easily erode the progress of freedom and democracy the way we understand it today. And too easily. It's as if dark matter and light are in some sort of competition, and if the light doesn't shine brightly enough, if transparency is not strong enough, if we stop trusting our institutions, which today is, I think, a current topic, and if we don't use our institutions properly or in new ways and strengthen them, then the dark matter rolls back the gains. We now have in Europe countries that used to be democracies that have turned into strongmen countries, and that includes countries in the middle of Europe. I think we're seeing a global map here. I work sometimes with Transparency International, and there's something strange about that map that I just want to point out to start us off in a wider discussion that maybe touches us more directly as people here today. Notice, so you can figure it out, right? The least corrupt countries in the world are in lighter shades, and the most corrupt countries are in darker shades. That would be ideal, an ideal picture of the world, if it wasn't for the very definition of corruption. Corruption is the abuse of power for private gain, the abuse of power at the expense of the powerless. Now look at the map again. If the most powerful countries in the world are not corrupt, then how come we have a picture where the poorest countries in the world are corrupt and we're not? If it's the powerful abusing those without power on a global scale, this map becomes interesting. These countries do not become corrupt by themselves. We play an enormous role in corrupting them. We work with their regimes to funnel money off to offshore accounts, and it used to be Switzerland, but after 9/11, Switzerland became a bit iffy. But the use of front companies, as was revealed in the Panama Papers across the globe, allows for this. So we make deals with the dictators at the expense of the people. And so the resources of these countries, of course, are funneled to us at the expense of the general welfare of the population, creating the type of resentment that leads to extremism. The extremism leads to civil wars. Civil wars lead to immigration and refugees. Today, there are more refugees in the world than there was even after World War II. Sex slavery is at its apex, and new routes are being uncovered every day. Some of my courageous friends at CNN went down to Libya and saw how sex slaves from several countries in Africa were being directly funneled, traded, and sold onwards to Italy. There is sex trade also from Asia. North Korea has been exporting girls for a long time. This corruption, we can ignore it and just think that it's out there, it happens far away from where we live. And as long as we're not directly a part of it, we can live in good conscience. But I would challenge that notion. I think that it is a frightening situation. And in the very current situation we have with the current presidency and the questions that have been raised about corrupt money funding his entire business empire and the entire US intelligence community agreeing that these same powers have aided and abetted his campaign, not always in straight ways, manipulating such things as what we thought were genuine grassroots movements. You know, they've infiltrated Black Lives Matter. They infiltrated even the gun lobby guys. I thought that was funny. But they understand how to play our system to create confusion, to create a demoralizing pattern. This is an old plan that was an old KGB plan that was shaped in the 1950s to demoralize us and eventually to use corrupt patterns to confuse us and leave us in a place where The Economist wrote last week that America is a country where votes don't seem to count. It's the only country where you elect a president not based on a majority, but based on an electoral college that was shaped when? During the time of slavery, when they were trying to make sure slave-owning states had equal enough voice to defend themselves. We are dealing with a constitution that wasn't perfect, that has been amended, obviously, for such things as free speech to begin with, the abolition of slavery. We have a Supreme Court that used to be wrong about some major issues. They were wrong about slavery. They upheld slavery 100 or so years ago. And more recently, they upheld a case called Citizens United, which allows unlimited amounts of money to be funneled into political campaigns. They argued that money is speech. Now I can show you a dollar. A dollar is a dollar. Words are words. Money is not speech. I come from a country that's very, very yellow. Maybe it was part of why I reacted the way I did to some of what I saw. I adopted America as the country where I wanted to live. I thought it stood for certain values that I strongly believed in and continue to believe in today. But when I look at that little country, Denmark, which ranks as the least corrupt country in the world and also the happiest, despite really bad weather.
I think Denmark is the least corrupt on this entire list.
Yeah, I mean, we've got some competition from Norway, you know, sometimes. But why is it? What can we learn from the country that's least corrupt in the world? Well, there's no campaign financing. You're not allowed to give money for campaigns. Money for campaigns is taken out of taxes. It's not much. You have to go on the air and you have to make your case. And we debate laws before they pass, not after, because there's been a shooting at a supermarket, hence the news forgets about, oh, there's a legislative process that is about net neutrality, is an actually super important issue. We should debate, we should have polls, people should argue their case. No, laws are passed in silence, in the corridors of power, where the lobbyists whom I first met when I was too young to be there, at about 21, 22, operate. And now we've entered a world where at the same time, you know, we have power of access to information we never had before. In the last 10 years, the power to organize through social media, powers we did not have before. But
well, talking about power, I mean, looking again at this map, you have the dark red countries, which are considered the most domestically corrupt governments, right? And then the light yellow countries, the least. And Transparency International defines corruption as the powerful taking advantage of their power for personal gains. So looking at these dark red countries, you know, they have some of the smallest GDPs or economies of the world. They're not very powerful countries. So is this actually telling an accurate story of what's actually going on a global corruption scale? Or is there another map that should be kind of drawn? Because if we look at some of the light-colored countries, they're the most powerful in the world, maybe they have some sort of role in terms of instigating corruption that happens at a domestic level in some of these
I mean, it's a very
third-world
very good question.
Yeah.
And the reason it's a good question is that corruption works a bit like magic. We were just talking about it before we walked in. Diversion is a very important part of how corruption works. Corruption is not easy to hide. It involves envelopes at the end of the day. Even if it's large diplomatic pouch envelopes, such as the ones that were flying from Baghdad to Moscow in diplomatic planes during the sanctions, all the kickbacks were literally put in diplomatic pouches. The map, to me, is funny. Even Denmark has companies like Maersk, which does most of the shipping around the world. They have enormous pharmaceutical companies. They have all of these companies were named and fined as part of the UN AIDS scandal. But the companies that were stationed in Panama or other less accountable countries were, of course, left alone. The whole point of democracy, I mean, if there wasn't democracy, we wouldn't be talking about corruption. Because what is a state? The definition of a state is the entity that has monopoly over the use of power over a given area. So as much as we like to call politics a science, the only scientific truth about politics in the history of our species is the theory of hegemonic stability. There is stability when there is a hegemon, one powerful force that can keep some peace. Because it is simply too strong to challenge. With democracy came a new definition of what the state is. Instead of just being the central mafia, it is a system of checks and balances. And what are they for? The whole point of democracy is to keep a check on corruption so that people are not completely screwed out of their earnings and that some social justice can prevail and that people can emerge through the system instead of just being kept down. In the most extreme cases as slaves or now in other cases as people that are so indebted that they can't, you know, their children cannot get a better education than they can and so on. This is the story that's coming out of rural America today also. We had a protest vote in this country. I don't know how they decided that Mr. Banana Hair reality TV was going to be their champion, but somehow it was a protest vote, which means that they feel disenfranchised. And we can't ignore this. We can't ignore that this guy has tendencies to like dictators. to be more friendly with Little Rocket Man and other people like that than he is with our allies. What have we done to ourselves? And how has it happened? It wasn't just a mistake. There was a plan. It's being unveiled now by Robert Mueller. I'm beginning to be familiar with how investigations work, and this one is working. September is going to be a storm. The big question for us, yeah, let's hope so. But even if Democrats have a majority of the votes, the way the system is rigged in the Electoral College means that they may have a majority of the votes and still not take the House. They have to get above 56% majority. So why are we not challenging these old electoral college rules? Why are we not? Why do we allow a Congress to try 35 times to abolish Obamacare when the public overwhelmingly is in support of Obamacare? How do these things happen in the dark? It's because we have inherited a democracy, but we're not working to strengthen it. I think that we're sitting here at Google, so obviously, you know, we're talking about the digital space. That's where the power struggle will happen, one way or another. And they're playing the game on the other side, and not just with cyber attacks and disruptive messaging and what both sides called fake news. When both sides call everything fake news, we get confused, right? What's the good source of information? And how easily are our media bought by advertisers? I write for some of these, so I don't want to knock them, but you open Time magazine and there's an advertisement for Boeing. Now, I don't have enough money to buy a Boeing plane, so I'm like, what's this advertising doing there? It's a placeholder in case there's a story they don't like. They withdraw the advertising. The editor jumps, and yeah, our freedom and our press will live or die together was the big quote by Pulitzer, or at least something like it. I think we're facing this kind of situation right now, and in the digital space is where the battle will play out.
Yeah. So you're basically saying that corruption is fought through democracy, strengthening democracy, upholding, you know, the principles of a democratic nation.
Yeah, and fighting for them.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we have values. They mean something. They're not just words.
Well, if America is sort of like the poster child of democracy, a democratic nation for the world, like, how do you think that? How resilient do you think our system is today in face of some of these new challenges?
I just listened to the former head of the CIA give an interview in which he said he was frightened to death. So I'm not in a position to disagree with that. The system would be resilient if the year was 1950, and even then there were issues. The military-industrial complex, etc. They had too much power. Eisenhower tried to warn us about it. But there's always going to be clusters of power in a given society, and there are always going to be efforts to lobby. The question is, what laws do we have in place? And are we enforcing these laws? We have anti-corruption laws that, if enforced, would stop half of U.S. trade with some of these most corrupt countries. So it's selective enforcement. It's selective awareness. We have a public that knows how to organize a protest, like Occupy Wall Street, but does not know how to make demands or vote in a way that we can learn a little bit from the 1968 generation, I think, when it comes to rocking the boat. Because I'll predict right now that this is a boat that if we don't rock it, it's not going in the right direction.
So talk about rocking the boat, you know, going back to the whole whistleblowing story of yours.
Well, I was young and I didn't understand the repercussions of pissing off the KGB and the CIA at the same time. And I was also lucky because they didn't know where to peg me, in a sense. I was told by a person in the know later on that I was, in fact, extremely lucky because the Russians thought I was a CIA plant, and the CIA thought I was a French plant, and like, nobody quite knew where to put me.
Well, you sort of blew the whistle before it became, I guess, popular on a mainstream level with Edward Snowden, right? Edward Snowden happened in, I think, 2013.
Yeah.
And then,
But
since
bad
then,
things
we've seen
happen
sort
to
of an upswing.
whistleblowers. I had made a transition to writing.
Yeah.
I'm sitting in Hollywood writing screenplays, okay? Because that's one of the best ways to communicate stories about our true life right now is through drama, apparently, because people have given up on the news.
Well, we've had this upswing
Yeah.
in whistleblowing, right?
Yeah,
You had
so
it
that's
kicked
a
off with
trend.
Snowden, and
Yeah.
then we also had, I think his name is Christopher Wylie from Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, and
which
some girl
really
from the
brought it
NSA
back into the news.
who was called Faith Justice or something like that. Always funny names.
So my question to you is, there might be many other people out there in a tough position, right, where they have certain very valuable information that they think that the public should be aware of. And if they were to disclose that information, it could sort of rock the boat, but possibly in the favor of democracy is what they might be hoping. So do you have any advice to them, I guess?
I do, because I'm forced to give it all the time. They get in touch with me, they read the book or they see the film, and they want to figure out how they can do something. The old saying is, when you see something, do something. But we all know that that's not always possible. You got to pick your battles in life, and you got to survive. Now I'm with 2 children in Hollywood. Do I see corrupt practices? Yeah, but like, am I rocking the boat? No, I'm trying to make a new career, right? So we all have times in life when
You're trying to make a new career, because you sort of had to abandon.
Well, diplomacy
your
was
last-
out for me, yeah.
Right.
The big job of a diplomat,
So
they say, is to go abroad and lie on behalf of your
Yeah.
country. But the real biggest job of a diplomat is to shut up.
Well, it seems like these whistleblowers are sort of left in these dire situations where
They send me
have to make
emails. They send me
large
emails. I send them
sacrifices.
over to my Proton Mail, and then I ask them to explain what it is they've got, and who, it's a question of strategizing. You don't need to put your own career on the line to get information out. You can work from the inside. There are sometimes, there have been reforms. And the UN invited me back to brief them about how do we treat, the whistleblowers are usually some of the top performing staff. They're not, just some person sitting at a desk somewhere. So how can we use these whistleblowers to actually improve our management? Okay, and you're like, is this blah, blah, or is this, it's still a risk to speak up, and we all know it. The question is when to speak up for maximum effect, and how to play the politics. The op-ed was in the Wall Street Journal because the Wall Street Journal wanted an anti-UN piece. My book came out through Nation Books from the left because I didn't want to be identified with this sort of war in the UN. I was a journalist by training. I was able to play that game. You can leak information, but you need to create a trustworthy relationship with a journalist that has a track record. Now, one person tried this. It was Edward Snowden. I don't know if some of you have seen the documentary of him meeting these guys in a hotel room in Hong Kong. He was the quintessential sacrificial, Christ-like whistleblower. He knew his life was over. That if he merely survived, giving his warning, and his warning to us, by the way, was serious. He warned us that the systems were in place so that if a wrong government came to power and just assigned certain tasks to Cyber Command, we would be facing something he called turnkey tyranny. And we're just going about our business, turnkey tyranny, yeah. We have to be a little careful. We have to think. We have to read through the lines when we read the news. And we have to choose our cause. We can't all, fight every cause. But I think people that are inside government is the most important. Because if you're in a corporation and something's wrong, It's also business. You can move on with your life. You can do other things. My biggest advice to whistleblowers, and they come to me a lot, is to first protect themselves, have a plan. Because if you're sacrificing yourself, you're not helping the fight against corruption. You're just, committing suicide. And unfortunately, if that worked, I would be like, okay, go ahead. But it doesn't. And what really works is to rock the boat. What really works is to electrify bureaucrats into action and shine light on certain aspects of how our world works. Because when some things come to light, suddenly they become scandals. And when things become scandals, bureaucrats have to figure out, well, how do I keep my seat? I'll be on the side of an investigation, or I'll be... There's a political logic to all of it. But if we're not able to use the tools at our disposal to shine light on some of the greatest inequities and acts of corruption in the world, then we're simply not using our medium correctly. They have a purpose other than to entertain us. And it is, in fact, very entertaining to see bureaucrats electrified. I promise you, it's actually quite entertaining. Because seeing people having to defend the indefensible is comedic. Try interviewing a BP official while there's a gusher in the Caribbean and say we have the situation under control, and on the other split screen there's like, it's funny, and it makes for good news, and we have to understand what the news people want. We have to play their game because they have our attention. And so I think good whistleblowing in general means getting the right kind of attention on an issue. Figure out where the story is, why that story is entertaining, because we have ADD as a people, as a generation, and if we're not entertained, we don't care.
So you say use tools at your disposal.
Yeah.
Right? And if you look at a lot of those tools today,
and entertainment is a big one of them. I mean, entertainment got Trump the presidency.
Well, a lot of these
entertainment
tools,
is power.
They're sort of born or developed in the digital space, right? In here, we're conducting a Google Talk, and many of the people in the audience are working in the digital space. I'm curious to know, do you have any sort of advice for people working in the digital space? Is it sort of good news, bad news?
No, I think there's opportunities here. I've seen cases of employee activism that have made enormous changes in the decisions of higher-ups in the corporate structure. The problem of the corporation per se is that it always looks for a profit and satisfying their board members. But now we talk about corporate social responsibility. Are we paying lip service to it, or are there certain values that are a little bit more crystal clear than that? And who's in charge of identifying them and of defending them? There's always a gap somewhere in the loop because money talks. The only thing that can stand up to money is humor and entertainment. We've got now late night shows that people watch more than they watch the nightly news. That says something about where our society is. We don't get our news from World News Tonight. We get it from the guys making fun of what's going on, because we're actually learning something. And they're unafraid, because they get laughs. Entertainment, and of course mobilizing and so on, we are in a state of flux here, because we don't know whether the digital age will be the end of us, because the logarithms that say this is your past and this will be your future will kind of command and control our actions and limit our freedoms, or whether we will be empowered in the digital space to be individuals, to be organized, and hopefully to not be infiltrated. When people start a movement like Black Lives Matters, they don't want Russian agents going in and messing up their messaging. And that's what's coming out from this investigation. So we live in incredibly interesting times right now. I just happened to have, dipped in the corruption soup a bit early, but it took me a while to think about it and what it means and why it's important. And I'm sitting before you today and dead frightened.
I think that's a great note to end on and open it up to audience questions. Not sure
Sorry, I
if
don't
anybody
mean to
has any
scare you.
questions, but if you do, you could go ahead and step up to the mic.
Thanks a lot for taking the time. I just read Bill Browder's book, Red Notice, the guy who came up in the Trump-Putin summit that lobbied for sanctions through the Magnitsky Act to sanction the individuals that were responsible for his lawyer's death in prison in Russia.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what you think about this law as an approach, the idea of sanctioning people associated with an oligarch or a dictator as a disincentive for corruption. Do you think this is an effective tactic that should be more adopted throughout the EU and other countries, or is it more of a symbol?
Targeted sanctions can be effective because they attack the people around a dictator. These are his support systems, his people. And why do you think Putin wanted Hillary to lose so bad? It was effective. Yeah. You know, we have to be careful when applying any type of sanctions. We have to not apply sanctions that harm entire populations. There's really never much gain from there. Mm-hmm. We have to apply sanctions that target leaders. Because corruption is like if the fish rots from the head, right? Without democracy, there would be no talk of corruption. If the king is the king and has all the power, what he does is not corrupt, it's legal. And we have to also see the distinction between legality and moral corruption. Somehow this country thought that slavery was not only legal but moral, based on the Bible and some like real mind-bending sort of arguments at the time, not so long ago. And some people spoke up. The biggest bestseller in America was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The media can change the path of a nation. Lincoln credited Harriet Beecher Stowe and other people with changing the public's mind about the biggest issue of the day. But democracy does not advance without a fight. On the beaches of Normandy, my dad took me there when I was young. He was a journalist, and I didn't know what he was doing, and he just took me there and showed me all the tombstones of the people who had died that day. And he just said, and I'm 9 years old, and he said, "This is why you're free." I'm like, wow, well, I don't want to be dead, but okay. You know, but it's a fight. It's a fight, and together we're stronger. So the individual whistleblower like Snowden, it pains me to see that he, of all places, he's stuck in Russia. You know, in an odd twist of fate. But he would, if he had stayed in Hong Kong, he would have turned up dead in a garage somewhere. I mean, it's quite clear.
Thank you.
But laws like this, yeah, they've lobbied hard to try to lift it, and they hate the people that imposed it. And no, I think if there's no consequences, but that's us trying to teach a dictatorship how to be less corrupt. Mm-hmm. We're only going to be that successful at that. Well, we have to look inside a little bit. We have to look at how much of an example are we to the world? Because people look at us, and during the Arab Spring, how did the Arab Spring start? As a movement against corruption. Some poor man's, he was a fruit vegetable salesman in the street. His cart was torn over and he didn't pay his dues. And the whole country went aflame because they thought this was so unfair. And the entire Arab Spring was about corruption. But since they had seen us being in cahoots with their former leaders and not be sure about who we support in each one of these conflicts, then the young people are attracted to the extremists that tell them the first thing they do when they come into a town is they say, what are the problems here? Boom, 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 you die. They seem like our version of you're fired, right? somebody who's going to come in and get order and restore some sense of justice. And that dynamic is very important to understand. People want justice. People want a system that is just, that works. So we can lecture other countries or we can sanction other countries, but we got to look first and foremost at our own processes. That's where we're going to make the biggest difference, and that's where we'll set the example that others will eventually copy when they get in a position to do so. When they overthrow their regimes, they've got somewhere to look to. Last time they overthrew their regimes, they looked to us. They were like, they don't care. Okay, let's figure it out among ourselves, and it was civil war. So I think, yeah, I think that the smart targeted sanctions are a good means to attack the problem, but we got to look at our own mechanism first. There's a lot of work.
Do you have any other questions?
So it seems like you're advocating for media as a way to sort of fight these problems, but it's also become clear that like media and telling stories works on both sides, and there's propaganda on both sides. So what are your thoughts on like this and how we can make sure that the stories that we tell and the stories that are told are things that are actually accurate and it will actually help the world?
Well, this is a very good question, because we're not only participating in telling stories, we're also story consumers. So when we click on clickbait, that's like somewhere between an ad and a slideshow, we are participating in the telling of news that is going to be at some level manipulative. Even if it's just to sell us shampoo, it's still going to manipulate us. If we seek out sources of news that are what I would call hard news, then yeah, we're going to get the information, but we won't be as entertained. We can entertain ourselves and click ourselves into tyranny. There is no guarantee that at the end of this century we're going to be living in what we call today a democracy. If we click the wrong buttons, it has consequences. Now, it's a game. To prevail, the greater values have to be more entertaining. The stories have to be more entertaining, more engaging than the other side's stories. And I think that's where I'd pitch the battle.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Hey, thanks again for taking the time. Just curious how you're thinking about your own personal safety and security now. Obviously, a lot of, I mean, Saddam Hussein himself is obviously not a threat, but there's still a lot of people who are associated with many of the people who are involved with the case that you whistle-blew on, who are still out there. I think there's a lot of interest just in the general, exposure to things that could be whistleblown.
Yeah.
Aren't you concerned about your own?
Well, there were times that were more dangerous, but once things come to light, the danger is on them. And the truth is, once the light shines on a problem, they invite you back to give a talk at their corporate retreat to their ethics group that they just set up after they paid a huge fine of $30 million to the U.S. government, none of which went back to Iraq, by the way. But they you can change the dynamic. Shedding light does change dynamics. People who know that they are doing or part of a system that is doing something wrong are afraid of the truth and of transparency. And when it is occurring, they switch sides, and just like a normal person would do, you play with a winning team. Right. I was shit scared at some point in my life, but I had to PTSD my way out of that.
Well, I think with that we'll go ahead and wrap up. But thank you, Michael, so much for coming.
Thanks.
We appreciate some of the powerful messages you're leaving us here with. Thank you to everybody.